The sun bathed the cobblestone streets of San Sebastian in golden light as Elena descended the hill with her mother, the light breeze gently lifting her hair. The local festival was in full swing, filled with laughter, music, and vibrant colors filling the air. Elena felt a quiet freedom, a sensation the big city had never given her. But her thoughts were distant. At 18, her life was about to change. Her father's plan for her was clear: to study in Madrid, build a career, a solid future. Love, however, was not part of that future. Javier, covered in sawdust and with a body marked by hard work in carpentry, watched from a distance, hidden among barrels of wine, observing the scene. He had always been drawn to the mix of tradition and joy at the festival, but this year something felt different. He saw her before he truly understood what was happening. Elena. Her brown eyes met his for a second, a moment that stretched time. Javier had never felt something like this, as if everything around him had become irrelevant. When she smiled at him for a brief moment, the world fell silent. Elena couldn't ignore the warmth in her chest. Who was this man? Simple, yet with a presence she couldn't explain. Something inside her knew he was different from the other boys she had met. That night, the encounter was inevitable. The colorful lights illuminated the sky as the lively music surrounded them. Javier approached slowly, his fingers sweaty from a nervousness he had never felt before. "May I have the honor of this dance?" he asked, and Elena's smile was all he needed. The dance began hesitantly, shyly, but soon transformed into something natural, as if they had done this 1,000 times before. Javier's hands, calloused from work, were gentle as they held Elena's waist, and as they spun under the stars, she felt an unexpected calm. She had been raised with so many expectations, so many paths already mapped out, but there in Javier's arms, everything seemed simpler, more real. The festival continued, but for them time had stopped. Every word exchanged, every shared laugh, every deep look seemed to seal something deeper, something neither of them yet understood. "Will you come back tomorrow?" he asked, with a barely concealed anxiety. Elena hesitated for a second, knowing that soon she would leave for Madrid, for the life her father had planned. But looking into Javier's eyes, how could she say no? The goodbye was brief but filled with unspoken promises. "Tomorrow," she whispered before walking away, her heart racing and her head full of confusion. The smell of salty sea air and the sounds of the festival faded into the background. With every step, Elena knew that when she returned the next day, something would be different. The world she knew was already starting to change. Javier stood still, watching her disappear into the crowd, his heart pounding in his chest. He was not a dreamer. His work had taught him to keep his feet on the ground, but something about that night made him believe that maybe destiny was dealing its cards. Tomorrow, he repeated to himself, determined to see where this path would lead. Their second meeting took place at sunset by the sea. Elena was there as promised, with a hopeful but restless look in her eyes. Javier found her sitting on the rocks, watching the waves gently crash onto the beach. The wind tousled her hair, and she seemed lost in thought, the weight of the decision she needed to make beginning to press on her shoulders. When he approached, she looked at him with a small, sad smile. There was something in that look that made Javier realize their time together was short. "Elena," he began, but she interrupted him with a gentle gesture, placing her fingers on his lips. "Let's just enjoy the moment," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. They stayed there in silence side by side, as the sun disappeared over the horizon. The cold ocean breeze didn't bother them. In fact, it seemed to intensify the connection they felt for each other. Deep down, both knew that the future was uncertain, but for now there was only that moment. In the weeks that followed, they met whenever they could, avoiding the watchful eyes of the small town, and especially Elena's father, a man who made no effort to hide his rigidity. Javier was the opposite of what he imagined for his daughter, a carpenter with no great ambitions, no promising future. It didn't matter that Javier was kind, hardworking, and treated Elena with the respect she deserved. To her father, he simply wasn't enough, and Elena knew that at some point she would be forced to choose. The day of their goodbye came sooner than expected. Elena's father, without warning, had moved up the trip to Madrid. Upon hearing the news, Elena ran to Javier's small workshop, her heart racing, tears welling in her eyes even before she opened the door. When she saw him holding a piece of wood in his hands, his face serious and focused, she felt a deep pain in her chest. "Javier, I'm leaving," she said, her voice trembling. He dropped everything immediately, his eyes wide, unable to process what he had just heard. "When?" he asked, almost breathless. "Tomorrow," Elena replied, and her tears finally fell. Javier pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, as if that could stop the inevitable. They stayed like that, together, for hours without saying a word, just feeling each other's warmth, trying to memorize every detail before everything was taken away. That night, Elena returned home, where her father had already packed the bags. "You are ready for your future, Elena," he said, without any understanding of the pain he was causing his daughter. She didn't argue. There was no room for questioning, not in her family. But as she climbed the stairs to her room, she felt the weight of the promise she had made to Javier. She swore to herself she would never forget him. No matter what the future held, her heart would always be his. The next morning, the town was still asleep when Elena left, without saying a personal goodbye to Javier. She couldn't bear it. He would see her leave from afar, she knew, and as the train pulled away, the coastal landscape fading into the background, Elena kept her eyes fixed on the window, fighting the urge to turn back. In San Sebastián, Javier watched the train disappear, his heart empty but determined. He wouldn't give up so easily. The years in Madrid passed slowly for Elena. The big city, with its constant hustle, offered none of the comfort she had hoped for. She devoted herself to her studies as her father demanded, but her heart never followed. Between law classes and social obligations, she found brief moments to dream. In every unfamiliar face she passed on the streets, she searched for a reflection of Javier. But the cruel truth was that he had stayed behind, and the distance between them seemed to widen as time passed. Elena's life was filled with commitments, high society parties, dinners with influential families, where her father hoped she would find a suitable match, but none of the men she spoke with could ignite what Javier had planted in her heart. She remembered his simplicity, the way his eyes sparkled when he talked about wood, how he could turn something rough into something beautiful with his own hands. Nothing in Madrid could replace that. Even with so many suitors around her, Elena knew she couldn't betray the silent promise she had made. In San Sebastián, Javier's life took a different path. He continued working in carpentry, earning respect among the town's residents. His business expanded, and he became known for his ability to turn wood into true works of art. However, every piece he created carried a silent melancholy. Deep down, he knew something was missing. Elena. The letters he had written were never sent, piling up in a box he kept hidden in his closet, a silent testament to a love he refused to forget. Life, however, waits for no one. Years later, Javier found comfort in Maria, a young widow from the town. She was kind and understanding, knowing that Javier's heart would never fully belong to her. But she accepted it. When they married, Javier tried to move on. They had 2 children, and for a time he believed he could leave the past behind. He dedicated himself to his family and work, but on silent nights, the thought of Elena still haunted him. The promise of eternal love was a burden he carried in silence. While Javier built a life, Elena closed herself off from love. Many times, her father insisted that she find someone, but she stood firm. "I haven't found anyone who makes me happy yet," she would say. But the truth was that, even after so many years, it was still Javier who filled her thoughts. She dedicated herself to her career, becoming a respected lawyer, but something inside her remained stagnant, as if the young girl in love from San Sebastián was still trapped somewhere in the past, waiting for something she knew might never come. Time was not generous with memories. For Javier, the years softened the pain, but they never erased it completely. He loved his wife and children, but deep down, he knew part of his soul was still trapped in that summer of the 1950s. For Elena, every decision in her life seemed to revolve around the absence of Javier, even though she would never admit it openly. Both lived their lives separately, like leaves carried by the wind, but the invisible thread that connected them never broke. Decades passed, and although they had never communicated, destiny seemed determined not to let that love die. Time had been relentless, taking away opportunities, building barriers, but there was something that resisted it all, something that the years had not been able to erase. The silent promise of eternal love, made on a beach by the sea, in a time that seemed so distant. By 2020, technology had advanced rapidly, connecting people far apart in ways once unimaginable. Elena, now an 86-year-old woman, felt the weight of the years on her shoulders. Her gray hair, her wrinkled skin, but her gaze still carried the same intensity of decades past. The office where she had spent most of her life was now empty, her legal career coming to an end. In her solitary afternoons, a computer had replaced her old law books, and it was on one of these afternoons that she received an unexpected notification, an invitation to join a Facebook group for former schoolmates. First, Elena hesitated. Those memories felt so distant, almost as if they belonged to another life. But something, a quiet curiosity, made her click on the invite. The group was full of aged faces, old photos from school reunions, and virtual laughter about the good old days. She hadn't expected to see anyone who had truly marked her life, until a familiar name appeared on the member list: Javier Martinez. Elena felt her heart race, something she hadn't experienced in years. It could have been a coincidence, but at the same time, the idea that he might be there, within reach of a message, made her tremble. On the other side, Javier had been convinced by his children to join Facebook. "Dad, you can reconnect with friends, see family photos," they told him. Reluctantly, he agreed. Navigating the platform was complicated for someone used to the rhythm of an analog life, but soon he found himself exploring his grandchildren's photos, receiving occasional messages from old acquaintances. Then the invitation to the school group appeared. When he saw Elena Garcia's name among the members, he almost dropped the mouse. Javier hesitated for days before sending the message. What would he say? What could possibly be left between them after more than 6 decades apart? Still, he clicked right and typed the first thing that came to mind: "Elena, is it really you?" The wait for a response was torturous. He didn't know if she remembered him, if the decades of silence had erased everything. But when the reply finally arrived, his heart nearly leapt from his chest. "Yes, Javier. It's me. It's been so long." The conversations began timidly, with touches of nostalgia. They laughed about the adventures of their youth, the stories from the festival where they met, the afternoons by the sea. But soon the tone of the messages deepened. The unspoken questions from years ago finally surfaced. "Why didn't you ever write to me?" Elena asked one day, a mix of sadness and curiosity. "I did write," Javier replied, "but I never sent them. I thought your father wouldn't allow it." That revelation hit Elena like a punch to the gut. She too had left unspoken words, moments of longing kept only to herself. As the conversations continued, their emotions resurfaced. It wasn't just nostalgia. There was something more, something that had never disappeared. Javier, now a widower, confessed, "I never forgot you, Elena. I always wondered what could have been if things had been different." Elena, her eyes welling with tears in front of the screen, responded with a sincerity she hadn't realized she still carried. "Neither did I, Javier. My heart has always been yours, even from afar." The virtual reunion was no longer enough. After weeks of exchanging messages, they decided to meet in person. Both of their hearts raced as they did in the old days. They didn't know what to expect. Were they still the same? Had their emotions survived the test of time? Javier suggested they meet in Madrid, as if proposing a second chance for a love that had never died. Without hesitation, Elena agreed. Madrid dawned cold, the wind cutting through the old streets, as Elena waited anxiously at the train station. The weight of the years was felt in her bones, but her heart, it beat wildly, as if she were about to relive a moment from her youth. She felt like that young girl who decades ago had waited for Javier for the first time in San Sebastián. Her gaze wandered through the crowd, searching for the man she once knew, but doubt gnawed at her. Were they still the same? Javier arrived with slow steps, leaning on his cane. Time had marked his body, but upon seeing Elena, a familiar sensation flooded his chest. She stood there, her gray hair blowing in the wind, and even though decades had transformed her face, the sparkle in her eyes remained intact. As he approached, Elena realized that, no matter how much time had changed them, the old feelings still lived inside them, untouched. When they finally stood face to face, words were unnecessary. There was a deep silence between them, filled with memories and silent promises that time hadn't been able to erase. Elena smiled, emotional, and Javier looked at her with the admiration of a man who had waited for this moment for more than 60 years. The embrace they shared was soft, but full of meaning, as if both knew that, somehow, fate had granted them a second chance. The following days in Madrid were a mix of nostalgia and discovery. They walked through old parks, visited cafes, and as they explored the city, they reminisced about the moments they had lived separately. For Javier, speaking about Maria, his deceased wife, brought a blend of sadness and gratitude. There was love and respect for her, but also the constant feeling that Elena had been his first and deepest love. Elena, in turn, shared her story of solitude in Madrid, the suitors she had rejected, and the opportunities she had let slip away because her heart always belonged to a distant past. As they relived these memories, both realized how much they had been shaped by each other's absence. Javier admitted that, even during his marriage, he had never stopped thinking about Elena, and that reflected in everything he did. She, on the other hand, confessed that her promise never to marry another man was not just a whim. It was a way to keep alive the memory of a love she believed had been lost. When their last day in Madrid arrived, Elena and Javier knew their lives would never be the same. The farewell at the station this time carried a sense of hope, not loss. Both knew that, regardless of how many years they had left, they no longer wanted to live apart. The past had been marked by absence, but the future, however uncertain, would be built together. Javier, with a calm smile, looked at Elena, certain that, after everything they had been through, they were finally ready to move forward together. She would accompany him wherever they went. No matter what destiny had in store, they knew that, for the first time in a long time, they had a new opportunity to live what had always been theirs. After weeks of reunion and promises of a future, Elena and Javier's lives finally seemed in sync with the time they had left. However, on an ordinary day, as Javier was organizing old family papers, a forgotten envelope caught his attention. The letter, written by his son Miguel many years before, had been lost among the documents. Its contents took Javier by surprise. Miguel revealed that during his years in London, he had fathered a child from a relationship that never materialized. Until that moment, Javier had no idea he had a grandson, and the discovery left him stunned. The letter, written with a sincerity Javier hadn't known in Miguel, expressed his regret for not telling his father sooner. At the time, the child's mother preferred to keep her distance, and Miguel, torn between fear and uncertainty, had left the situation unresolved. The initial shock was quickly replaced by urgency. Javier felt the weight of omission, both from his son and from himself, for not insisting on knowing more about Miguel's life outside of Spain. Now, with Miguel gone, the only possible link to that part of his family was this unknown grandson. The impact of the revelation was difficult to process. Javier felt a mix of regret and hope. There was a life he didn't know about, a chance to reconnect with his past through the son he hadn't had the opportunity to know better. He knew finding this grandson wouldn't be simple, but he couldn't ignore the possibility of building something from this truth, revealed so late. Javier's mind began racing, imagining how he could possibly locate the young man. When he told Elena about the grandson, she sensed the mix of anxiety and duty Javier was carrying. Even though they had finally found each other, his heart was now divided between rekindled love and the need to mend the past. Elena immediately understood that he would need to embark on this new journey, and without hesitation, she decided to support him. Though she knew it would bring challenges and perhaps delay the plans they had begun to make together, she also understood the depth of what this family reunion meant to Javier. The decision to travel to London was made quickly. Javier felt that time was merciless and that each passing day could be a lost opportunity to meet his grandson. Elena, by his side, prepared herself emotionally for what lay ahead. It wasn't just a trip to learn more about Javier's life. It was also a journey for both of them, in search of something that would connect them even more deeply. During the trip, Elena reflected on how life twists and turns, how fate seemed to repeatedly test the resilience of their feelings. When they arrived in England, the reality of the search set in. Javier had little information, only the mother's name and the certainty that the young man lived somewhere in the vast city of London. The possibilities were endless, but he was determined. There was a thread of hope that drove him, the need to discover not only his grandson's whereabouts but also a part of himself he had lost over the years. For Elena, accompanying Javier on this journey meant more than supporting her love. It was also a step toward building something that, for both of them, had been interrupted by time. The search began with uncertainties. London, with its vastness and frenetic pace, seemed overwhelming for Javier and Elena. The two walked through the bustling streets, trying to get familiar with the city that made them feel the weight of time even more. Javier, with only a few details in hand, began researching public records and contacted lawyers who might be able to help. The only clue was the name of the grandson's mother, a woman who, according to Miguel's letter, had preferred to cut ties and keep her distance. The days passed slowly, and the anxiety grew. Javier tried to stay calm, but the desire to find his grandson consumed him. There were moments when he questioned whether he should continue. The fear of the unknown was real. What if his grandson didn't want to meet him? What if the mother had hidden his existence for a reason? These questions swirled in his mind constantly, but Elena's presence at his side comforted him. Even in silence, she was his anchor. She was there, willing to face any adversity with him. On a gray afternoon, just as hope was beginning to fade, a phone call brought a breakthrough. The lawyer Javier had contacted managed to locate an address connected to the grandson's mother. It was a small house in the outskirts of London. The news reignited a flame of determination in Javier. He knew this would be his only chance to correct what time had stolen. When Elena saw the mix of relief and fear in his eyes upon receiving the news, she knew it was time to face reality. They arrived at the address in the late afternoon. Javier stopped in front of the house, his hands trembling and his heart pounding. Staring at that door represented the crossroads between past and future. He felt paralyzed for a moment, as if he was about to step into the life of a stranger. And he was. Yet, the strength of family love propelled him forward. With Elena by his side, he took a deep breath and walked up to the door. Every step was a step into the unknown, and every heartbeat was a reminder of what was at stake. The door was opened by a middle-aged woman, her expression cautious. She was the mother of his grandson. Javier, not exactly sure how to begin, explained who he was and why he was there. There was honesty in his words and a silent plea for understanding. She listened carefully, without interrupting. When he finished, she remained quiet for a long moment, making the air around them feel even heavier. Then, in a serious tone, she revealed that her son knew of his grandfather's existence, but had never found the courage to seek him out. Javier felt a wave of relief and nervousness. He knew the search wasn't over yet, but he was closer than he had imagined. The mother offered a crucial piece of information. His grandson Tomas lived nearby in the same town and worked at a motorcycle shop. She gave him the address but offered no guarantees about how the young man would react to seeing him. Javier thanked her with an emotional look, his heart now racing not just with anticipation, but with the real possibility of finally meeting part of his family. With the new address in hand, Javier and Elena's journey was not over, but the next step was clear. The hope of a new connection, once remote, now shone brightly before them. With Tomas' address in hand, Javier and Elena set off the next day. The motorcycle shop where his grandson worked was in a modest neighborhood, with narrow streets and old houses. Javier, who had spent so much time working with his hands, felt a strange connection imagining his grandson in this environment, surrounded by machines and tools, shaping metal as he had shaped wood. As they approached the shop, Javier's heart seemed to race, each beat reflecting the mix of anxiety and hope consuming him. When they arrived, they saw the shop's worn sign and the familiar sounds of metal being worked. Javier stood still for a few seconds, looking through the foggy window. Inside, a tall young man with dark hair was bent over a motorcycle, adjusting parts with precision. Even from a distance, Javier could see something of Miguel in the boy, something of himself. It was like looking at both the past and the future at the same time. He took a deep breath and, with Elena by his side, stepped into the shop. The smell of grease and oil enveloped them as they crossed the door. The young man glanced at them briefly, then returned to his work, unaware of who they were. Javier, his voice trembling, approached, calling him by name. Hearing his name from a stranger's mouth, Tomas looked up, confused. There was an uncomfortable distance in the air, as if both knew this moment would change something irreversible. Javier then carefully introduced himself, explaining that he was Miguel's father and, therefore, his grandfather. The words came out slowly, as if they carried the weight of all the years lost. Tomas remained silent, his eyes evaluating the man before him. He had known about his grandfather's existence but had never had the courage to seek him out. He had imagined this meeting many times, but the reality was far more disorienting. Seeing Javier there, vulnerable, with Elena watching patiently by his side, stirred feelings in him that he hadn't expected. Finally, after a long moment of tension, Tomas set down his tools and extended his hand to Javier, a gesture of acknowledgement. The simple action was enough to break down part of the invisible wall between them. Javier shook Tomas' hand firmly, feeling the strength of the young man, but also a deep connection that didn't need many words to be understood. As Elena watched, she felt an overwhelming emotion rise in her chest. She was witnessing not just a family reunion, but a silent reconciliation with Javier's past. They were all there, united by an invisible thread that time had not been able to sever. The conversation between them started slowly. Javier shared memories of Miguel, stories Tomas had never heard. The young man, in turn, spoke about his mother, the doubts he had always had about his father's family, and the life he had built in London, far from his origins. The bond between grandfather and grandson grew stronger with each word, with each shared memory. There was a mutual understanding that didn't depend on the time they had lost, but on the desire to build something new from that moment forward. By the end of the afternoon, as they said their goodbyes, there was a sense of relief in the air. Javier had finally met his grandson. Though the future remained uncertain, that meeting represented the first step in rebuilding lost family ties. Elena, standing beside Javier, knew that together, they had overcome yet another barrier. The road ahead, even with its challenges, now seemed brighter. Back in Spain, Javier and Elena carried with them the lightness of a mission accomplished. The reunion with Tomás had restored a lost part of Javier, and for Elena, it represented the certainty that they were ready for the next chapter of their lives. San Sebastián welcomed them with its usual tranquility. The sun shone on the coastal streets, and the smell of the sea brought a sense of familiarity. They were finally ready to live in the present, free from the shadows of the past. To Javier, who once carried the weight of regrets in silence, now felt that time hadn't completely defeated him. Meeting Tomás gave him the chance to honor Miguel's memory, reconnect with his family legacy, and above all, realize there was still so much to live for. Every morning, as he worked on small furniture restorations, he thought about how much his life had changed and how Elena's love had been the anchor through each of these transformations. 3. Elena, for her part, found herself more at peace than she had ever been. After years of solitude, she had returned to the place where her heart had always belonged. She and Javier began making plans to renovate a small house by the beach, a project they both cherished. For Elena, that house symbolized a new beginning, not just for their relationship, but for everything they had built together since their reunion. 4. Their conversations about the future were frequent, but without the rush of before. Both knew that time was no longer as generous, but that didn't matter. What really mattered was the quality of the moments they shared. As Javier carved small details in the wood for the house, he reflected on his new relationship with Tomás. The young man was willing to visit them soon, to better understand his Spanish roots and the grandparents he barely knew. This expectation brought a new kind of hope. 5. The days passed with a different kind of serenity. Their mornings were filled with the quiet companionship that only those who love deeply can share. The afternoons were often spent watching the sea, talking about the past, but always with their eyes on the future. Both felt that they were finally where they belonged. The obstacles they had faced, the separations, the sacrifices, the regrets, now seemed part of a necessary journey that had led them exactly to where they stood. 6. Javier, from time to time, returned to the workshop, but now without the anguish of someone who had lost control of his own life. He knew he was building something lasting, something that didn't depend solely on skilled hands, but on a heart that had healed over time. Elena, watching him work, felt a deep gratitude for everything they had overcome. She knew their love had withstood the test of time in a way that few stories allowed. 7. And so, surrounded by the tranquility of the small town that had united them so many decades ago, Javier and Elena lived out their final days in peace. The house they built together by the sea became a symbol of everything they had faced and conquered. The love that had survived so many adversities now flourished, full, proving that, despite everything, time was never the true enemy, only the silent guardian of an inevitable reunion. Love beyond time reminds us that true love withstands adversity and the passage of years. Elena and Javier, despite being separated for decades, proved that fate always finds a way to reunite those who are destined to be together. It's a story of reconciliation, forgiveness, and the importance of family bonds. More than that, it makes us reflect on what truly matters in life: the people we love and the connections we maintain. If you enjoyed this emotional story, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell so you don't miss any content, and share it with your friends. Let's spread love.